Well, good morning, everybody. We are here for our final morning together doing the Apologetics course. Today, we're going to be thinking primarily in the first half about the person and work of the Lord Jesus. And then in the second half, we'll do our last demo talk that's going to be reflecting on, I guess it's partly on the implications of the resurrection and how that is a positive thing for our lives, the different how the resurrection basically changes how we view all of human history and our role in in the story of life. That we have a positive part to play in this world because of the resurrection of Jesus. That's where we're going. I want to start with a question. How can you be sure that Christianity isn't just wishful thinking? How do you know that it's not just something that you believe in because it makes you feel good? That when you live in a world that's big and scary, whenever hard things happen, whenever you're faced with the inevitability of death, that Christianity is just a comforting illusion. As Stephen Hawking once put it, it's a story that we tell ourselves because we're afraid of the dark. How do you know that Christianity isn't just all wishful thinking? Well, the most important answer to that is that Christianity is about things that really happened in human history, things which are open to our investigation. Jesus is a real person, and he really did things, and he made a real impact and a real difference. He left his mark on all of human history, which is what you'd expect if he is who he said he is, that he is the Son of God come in the flesh to do something to put this world right, to restore things onto the tracks that God has intended. So how do we know Christianity is not just wishful thinking? Ultimately, it boils down to the historicity of the person and the work of Jesus Christ. Before we think more about the historical evidence for Jesus, I just want to reflect a little bit to warm us up on the historical significance of Jesus. There's this wonderful poem entitled One Solitary Life. No one knows for sure who wrote it, but it really captures just some of the incredible contradiction that seems to be at the heart of Christianity, which is that Jesus was nobody, and yet he has made more of an impact on history than anyone else. So here's how it goes. He was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant. He grew up in another village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family or owned a home. He didn't go to college. He never lived in a big city. He never traveled more than 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things that usually accompany greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his garments, the only property he had on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 20 centuries have come and gone, and today he is the central figure of the human race. I am well within the mark when I say that all the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all the parliaments that ever sat, all the kings that ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of man on this earth as much as that one solitary life. What explains and what accounts for the impact of this person, Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah? That's the question that people have to ultimately grapple with. Who is Jesus, and why are we still talking about him 2 millennia later? Now, throughout this course, I've introduced you probably every week to my literary friend, Tom Holland, the secular historian up until quite recently, whenever he would now claim to be a Christian. Dominion, his big book out last year, just been released in paperback. I like the front cover of the paperback more than I like the cover of the hardback. Just look at it; it's on the right there, the red one. You see, there's the pictures that there's architecture, there's sort of figures from history, there's well, Hitler's there for good reason, because he's one of the leading people in the West who tried to abolish Christianity and its impact on society. He is, if you like, an antichrist. There's the Women Unite slogan. There's Martin Luther King for racial equality. And it's just saying that behind all the things that we take for granted today, there's the Romans and the Greeks, some of the architecture, but actually the thing that has made the West what it is, the way that we think, what we believe, the things that we cherish and value, is actually the person of Jesus Christ. Then just a few weeks ago, a new book was released, a book of essays, the one on the left, Revolutionary, Who Was Jesus, Why Does He Still Matter? And Tom has edited this book. It's quite spotty. I was hoping for more. I don't think you need to buy it and read it, to be honest with you, but you can go on Amazon and read the introduction from Tom Holland. That's worth just reading on Amazon, look inside. And he makes this comment just towards the end of his introductory essay. He says, 2,000 years and 20 after the birth of Christ, we remain children of the Christian Revolution, the most disruptive, the most influential, and the most enduring revolution in history. That's true. Jesus and the Christian church that he left in this world has transformed the world in incredible ways that today we take utterly for granted, and we've forgotten as a society actually the origins of so many things that we believe and think and feel. So Jesus is of huge historical significance, but also of continuing contemporary significance in ways that often we don't realize until it takes a secular historian like Tom Holland come along and say, actually, you know, I'm amazed, as he writes in Dominion, I am not a Christian by belief, but I am a Christian in every other sense. That's quite a phenomenal thing. That's why Tom Holland is one of my go-to guys at the present time. Okay, Jesus is significant historically and contemporarily. But there are some people today who wonder, who continue to say, particularly in the age of the internet, where one of the things of the internet is the democratization of information, where anyone can say anything and it can appear as equal to good scholarship. It's all equal on the internet, and there's a movement that has gained a lot of momentum in just the last 5 years or so, maybe last 10 years, called Mythicism. At the heart of Mythicism is the belief that Jesus Christ never existed, and that actually that it has it has various forms, but basically Christianity and Jesus is basically a conglomeration of different ancient myths all put together. Up until Mythicism's revival in the last 5 or 10 years, that was nonsense. As far as scholarship, as far as anyone who is a professor of history in all the universities in the world, the overwhelming, in terms of 99% of people would have said Jesus definitely existed. Bart Ehrman is a very interesting person. He was a conservative evangelical Christian. He was going through seminary. He's now a professor of New Testament. Ehrman, though, has given up on his Christian faith. He now would call himself an agnostic. He would often say that he lost his faith because of things he discovered in the biblical manuscripts that made him question their reliability. But actually, those who know him would tell a different story, that actually it was the problem of suffering that ultimately made Ehrman give up his faith. But Ehrman, as now an enemy to the gospel and to the Christian faith, has written this incredible book entitled "Did Jesus Exist?" The historical argument for Jesus of Nazareth. And he's written this book against the mythicists. And he says, whatever else you think about Jesus, he certainly did exist. Kind of just phenomenal. Ehrman, as much as I disagree with Ehrman on so many things, this is a very helpful book for just laying out the evidence to say, look, it is a well-established fact of history for which we have a great deal of probability that Jesus really lived and died. These are things that we know. Historically, we're always talking about probabilities, never certainties. You can never be certain when it comes to history. It's not like science. You can't put events of history into a test tube and run the experiment again and see what happens and check it out. We're always dealing with probabilities, but the existence of Jesus is one of those things that is exceptionally highly probable in history. And so whenever people, if you ever hear someone say, there is no evidence that Jesus ever existed outside the Bible, that's just a lie. That is just that is utter misinformation. That is just hashtag fake news. For example, one of the Roman emperors at the time of Christ was Tiberius Caesar, a very significant figure. He in a sense is the most important man in the world at the time of Jesus. And what we have, historically speaking, to know that he exists is we've got 10 sources that say that he was a real living person within the first 150 years. 9 of those are non-Christian sources. One of them is the Bible, because he comes up in the Gospels. For Jesus Christ, though, in one sense, he's the opposite end of the spectrum. He should be just absolute nobody. He's a peasant at the far edge of the empire. He's a nobody and a nothing in a nowhere land. But we have 42 sources for the existence of Jesus in those same first 150 years. Although, again, it's 9 outside of the Bible. What I'm saying here is that we have as much reason historically to believe in Jesus Christ as we do for believing in Emperor Tiberius. And everyone accepts that Tiberius existed. And anyone who says that Jesus didn't exist, well, they are not making a historical assertion there. They are very much revealing their own biases. Now, what I would like to do for the next few minutes is I would actually like to walk you through the different sources that we have for the historical existence of Jesus. Some might think this is a bit boring. Some would say this may be a bit unnecessary, but part of what we're doing in apologetics is not just so that we can share this stuff with other people confidently, but so that we in ourselves as Christian believers might be able to have confidence that the things that we believe about Jesus are real and true, that it's not just wishful thinking, that this really happened. And so I want to take you through the historical sources that indicate that Jesus really lived. What really is amazing about the non-Christian historical sources is that the contours of the whole story and life of Jesus are in them. Even if you never had a Bible, you didn't have access to the Gospels and the Bible, from just the non-Christian sources, you would be able to piece together much of the story and the early beliefs of Christians about Jesus. That's astonishing. That's incredible. We should take heart at this. So let's look at the sources. First one I want to take you to is Josephus. He was one of the leading Jewish historians at the time. He was a bit of a turncoat. He was a proud Jew, but then whenever the Romans invaded and began to put down the Jewish civil war in the 60s and 70s, Josephus turned and started to work for the empire. But there are 2 references to Jesus in the Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus's key historical work of that time. The later one is this short one, which is uncontested, which talks about James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. James was one of the leading people of the church who was martyred in Acts chapter 12 by Herod Agrippa. Was it Agrippa? One of the Herods. The other reference to Jesus is a contested one, and I'll explain why shortly, but here's what it says. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats. He was the Christ. He appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the prophets had foretold these and 10,000 wonderful things concerning him. That's pretty good, isn't it? That's nice. The problem is that it just cannot be true, because Josephus never was a Christian. He was very much a loyal Jew, Orthodox Jew. He never followed Christ, so he cannot say he was the Christ. What we have here is evidence that some of the Christian scribes in later centuries who preserved the works of Josephus having interpolated or added in some more things than they should have. We know that has definitely happened because we have access to a separate strain. I think it's the Syriac translations of Syriac language. Is it Egypt? The Syriac language copies of Josephus, and they don't say he was the Christ. They say some said that he was the Christ, and they don't tell you about him appearing alive again on the third day. That bit's missing. That's probably the authentic Josephus account. But the key thing is that Josephus tells you Jesus really existed, and that he had a reputation for being a healer and a miracle worker, and that even some claimed that he was the Messiah. But Joseph also tells you about other people who claim to be the Messiah at the same time. You just need to know Jesus really existed as far as Josephus is concerned. That's our first historian. The next, Josephus would be the most important Jewish historian. The most important Roman historian would be Tacitus. Tacitus writes these things in his book, The Annals. We know most about the Roman emperors from Tacitus. He's a very important source historically. And here in this source, he's talking about things that happened in Rome during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. You need to know that this also tracks with biblical history. You might remember that whenever Paul first arrived in the city of Corinth in Acts chapter 18, that he met Priscilla and Aquila, and it says that they were natives of Rome, but they had traveled to Corinth because the Jews had been expelled from Rome. It seems that there had arisen conflict within Judaism, within Rome, between those who were Orthodox Jews and those who were Christians, Jews who were followers of Jesus the Messiah. And this disturbance caused so much trouble that the Romans got involved, and they said, right, Jews, we're not going to get involved in your petty religious disputes. All of you leave. And so Priscilla and Aquila leave, and they go to Corinth to carry on their business. Later on, when Paul writes to the Romans, Priscilla and Aquila are in chapter 16. He sends greetings. So obviously they return after Emperor Tiberius dies. They return to Rome. And that's also part of the reason why the book of Romans has this sort of interplay between Jews and Gentiles. Because what's happened is there's been 10 years or so where there've been no Jews in Rome, only Gentile Christians. And the Jewish Christians return to Rome, and the Gentile Christians aren't being kind and fair. And so that's why Paul does what he does in Romans. So there you go. There's a bit of biblical background that correlates then with what Tacitus says. He writes about how in Rome at this time there were this group called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. So there you go. Jesus existed, that he founded a group called Christians. He was crucified. That's the extreme penalty. There's a dating in a sense, Tiberius, Pilate, but also this recognition that there is some spectacular, scandalous story about Jesus, some superstition, some supernatural events that followed his crucifixion that spread across the whole known world. Very interesting, confirms history, biblical history. Let's see another one. Suetonius was a Roman historian, a little bit later than Tacitus, and he's famous for his books chronicling the lives of the different Caesars. Again, we have a reference here to what was going on during the reign of Claudius that we just talked about. Because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, Emperor Claudius, expelled them from the city. So again, that's that background, that story. It's all about Jesus, the Christ. And then in every one of his books reflecting on Emperor Nero, this doesn't so much reflect on Jesus, but this doesn't so much mention Jesus, but mentions Christians and something they believe. So after the Great Fire at Rome, punishments were also inflicted on the Christians, a sect professing a new and mischievous religious belief. There you have a reference there to the followers of Jesus, and again, this belief that they have that the Romans think is crazy, namely the resurrection from the dead. So there you go, some more historical sources. Lucian was a satirist. He liked to make fun of people. He was like your late night comedians making their political punditry through comedy. And Lucian is interesting because he is mocking the Christians in this extract. He tells you a lot about what Christians believe and what Christians do in a mocking way. This is the Stephen Colbert. This is the Seth Meyers. This is the I forget his name. You can see his face. He's the English guy who's now over in America. He's been in Doctor Who and things. I forget his name. But here's Lucian. He says, the Christians, worship a man to this day. The distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers. From that moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. Again, very clearly, references to Jesus and to the fact that Jesus was crucified. The essential beliefs of Christians in the immortality of the soul and the resurrection of the body. Jesus is taken very seriously as someone who really existed by Lucian. He's just laughing at them. They worship a man. How stupid. Not just a man, but a crucified man. How utterly ridiculous. Someone else is Pliny the Younger. Pliny was a Roman government official. I think he was in Asia Minor, Turkey. And he wanted to know what to do about the Christians. There was persecution happening at his time against the Christians. And he wrote to the emperor to ask, what do I do about these people in my province? What am I to do with them? And there are too many of them. And one of the things that Pliny does in his letter to the Roman emperor is he describes the Christians and what they do and what they're like, how they behave. And he says this, part of what he says is they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a god. And what happens is the reply comes back from the emperor, basically, leave them alone, unless you have to deal with them, leave them alone, but don't go out of your way to get them and to burn their Bibles and things, just leave them alone. This is a new one here. Celsus was a Roman philosopher, and he wrote just a scathing attack against the early Christians in the 2nd century. I only came across this very recently, but he writes in his book Against Christianity. Now, if the Christians worshipped only one God, they might have reason on their side. But as a matter of fact, they worship a man who appeared only recently. They do not consider that they are doing a breach. They do not consider what they are doing a breach of monotheism. Rather, they think it perfectly consistent to worship the great God and to worship his servant as God. When they call him Son of God, they're not really paying homage to God. Rather, they are attempting to exalt Jesus to the heights. This is the end of Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code. That in 325, the Council of Nicaea, the Christian Church invented the idea that Jesus was the Son of God. No. Over 150 years before the Council of Nicaea, you have an enemy of the Christian Church saying that Christians believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and that there is already implicitly the Trinity, because they do not worship 3 gods, but they say that they are still monotheists, that there is one God, and yet there is a plurality from the Godhead. Astonishing. This is even more credible evidence because it is from an enemy who is out to disparage and attack Christianity. It is in his interests to capture what they really believe and then destroy them for being stupid, for being illogical. This is an incredibly good source. What else do we have then? We have further references to Jesus. For example, in the Jewish Talmud, that's the collection of rabbinical commentaries and writings. And Jesus mentioned, most usually in the form of curse. Anyone who follows Jesus is cursed. Anyone who says they're born of a virgin is cursed. Stuff like that. The Jewish rabbis took very seriously the person of Jesus and the claims that he made to be the Messiah, and they rejected them and they cursed him and all those that followed him and believed him. So they take very seriously the historical reality of Jesus. Then there are the Gnostic Gospels. We talked about them before. These are the additional New Testament. These are additional books that some people say that there are more than 4 Gospels: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, all these different things. Gospel of Judas. The Gnostics were a cult who adopted Jesus and tried to piggyback on the back of Jesus to present their ideas and to recruit followers. And what's interesting about the Gnostics is, and they were a long time afterwards, these are into the 2nd century, but what's interesting is that they obviously believe that Jesus was a real person, because that's they're saying, you know, Jesus, there's the public things that Jesus said that they're in your 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but then there are the secret things that Jesus told only the initiates, only the inner circle. And if you want to know about the real secrets, the real, Gnostic means knowledge, the real way of salvation is the secret knowledge. If you want to be a part of the secret knowledge club, you've got to become a Gnostic. Come listen to us. We've got the extra Gospels. So it's Scientology, basically. Pay your money and you'll get into the higher levels of Scientology and find out about Xenu and things like that. So Gnostics take very seriously Jesus exists, and they're trying to profit off the back of the existence of Jesus. So those are the non-Christian sources. But that's not all we have in the 1st century or 2 after Christ. We have just the writings and the letters of the Apostolic Fathers: Clement, Polycarp, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and many more. So the earliest letters that we have from the early church outside of the Bible are filled with stuff about Jesus. Christianity's always been about Jesus. Big surprise. Also filled with quotations from the Bible, so that like we thought about a few weeks ago, it's possible from all the quotations of the early church fathers to reconstruct almost all the entire New Testament just from their writings alone. Again, historical evidence. Some of the church fathers had direct links with the apostles. Apostle John was connected with Polycarp and with Papias, 2 of the church fathers. So you have them being one step removed from Jesus. Very important, their contributions. So there you go. You've got all this historical evidence. Last bullet point, there's the church oral traditions and creeds. You have in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 this incredible creed, it seems, that Paul says, you know, what I received, I entrusted to you, that Jesus Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised again according to the scriptures, and he appeared. And he goes through this long list of all the different people he appeared to, and then Paul says, and then last of all, he appeared to me. Scholars will tell you that that's a creed. That's something Paul writing in the early 50s AD. That was obviously something that the church recited. It's written poetically, rhythmically, and so you've got something that about the resurrection of Jesus that leads that in the early 50s that can be traced back into the mid 30s, around just a year or 2 after the events. That's incredible. Christianity has always been a resurrection religion. Philippians 2, the great song and poem that maybe you'll hear or be preaching even on in the coming weeks at Christmas time, that though he was in the form of God, did not count equality of God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant, and being found in the likeness of man, submitted himself to death, even death on the cross. And therefore God is pleased to highly exalt him above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow. Paul again writing early 60s, but presenting this hymn of the church, this confession of the church about Jesus and his being pre-incarnate, his incarnation, his crucifixion, his resurrection, his ascension, and ultimately his eternal glory. It's all there from the earliest of times. This is 270 odd years before Nicaea. the church has always believed this stuff in the earliest of times. History shows it. And even if all of these sources that we just looked at, they don't consider the eyewitnesses that we find in the Bible, the New Testament eyewitnesses. Some people would dismiss them, so you can't really, of course, the people who are in the Bible would say what they say, they're biased. But that's not how history works. They're also eyewitnesses themselves, written within the lifetime of Jesus, written within the living memory of Jesus. And although historically we don't privilege and say that because they're in the Bible, we have to take them as truth. But we do have to certainly say that historically they are sources, they are eyewitnesses, and we've got to consider what they say. And they complement the picture that we find from these secular sources. So I hope you see here that the historical reality of Jesus is it's incredible outside of the Bible. When we move to just think about the eyewitnesses that we find in the New Testament, there are three real heads that they tell us about Jesus, which are so important to think about. And that's, first of all, the divine claims of Jesus. The apostles and their associates, they record for us that Jesus made certain claims about himself that got him killed. Why was Jesus killed? It was on the charge of blasphemy, that he made himself out to be equal with God. C.S. Lewis then famously came up with a trilemma where he said, when you consider what Jesus said, you can't just say he's a good moral teacher who inspires us all that's shamefully died or are too young. No, on the basis of the things that Jesus claimed for himself, that he was the Son of Man, who is the glorious divine figure in Daniel 7, that he claimed to be the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, the servant of the Lord. That those two things no one had ever brought together and combined like Jesus did, and his self-understanding. But Lewis says that you're left with only three choices: that either Jesus was a liar, he's claiming to be the Son of God and he's not, or he's a lunatic, he claims to be the Son of God and he's out of his mind, or actually he claims to be the Son of God and that's who he is. He's the Lord. Liar, lunatic, Lord, mad, bad God. You've got to pick, you've got to decide. So that's something that we get from the eyewitnesses in the New Testament, is that you're forced to confront the divine claims of who Jesus is. And those divine claims are echoed in the non-biblical sources that we just looked at. Also, you find in the eyewitness accounts in the New Testament the divine acts of Jesus. Jesus doesn't just talk the talk, I'm the Son of God, but he also performs the talk. His powerful acts, his miracles, point to his person, that he is the divine Son of God and dwelt by the Holy Spirit, the one whom the Father has sent to bring the kingdom on earth and to undo all the brokenness in this world. That's what his healings, what his exorcisms, what his nature miracles are all about, revealing the kingdom of God, and that God is going to take all the chaos and brokenness and evil of this world and he's going to subdue it and make all things new and right in a new creation. These are the works of God being performed at the will and at the hands of Jesus. But also the New Testament writers, especially Matthew, they're insistent in telling us that Jesus, his person and his works, fulfill divine prophecies. We're going to be thinking about this in the coming weeks as we think about Christmas and the Christmas story, that Jesus is the one who fulfills all the promises. He's the descendant of Abraham. He's the descendant of David. That's Matthew 1, the genealogy. Luke, he's the one promised to Adam, the son of Adam. That's Luke's genealogy in Luke 3. There are so many of these prophecies that were outside of Jesus' control, that he could not control his ancestry, his lineage. He could not control the place where he was going to be born, where his family were brought from Nazareth down to Bethlehem. I'm preaching on that next Sunday. So many of the things that concern his birth, the virginal conception, all of these things were outside of his control. All of these things together, what we have is historical eyewitnesses who tell us that Jesus Christ claimed to be the Son of God and did things that demonstrated that he was the Son of God and that he was the one whom was promised and that Israel had been waiting for all these years. That's the historical evidence. It's incredible. It's overwhelming. It's powerful. Nevertheless, whenever we introduce people to the Gospels, I find that people very quickly, they hit the miracles and they begin to switch off. They begin to wonder, how can I take this as history whenever I have no experience of miracles? And we don't take seriously stories of miracles in the past. We think, well, that's what they thought back then, that they were silly, they were unscientific, they were gullible. And then we hear about Jesus, him exorcising demons, him calming storms, him multiplying food. People just start thinking, well, this is obviously made up fiction. This is legendary stuff. This is mythical stuff. That's the assumption. We heard a few weeks ago from C.S. Lewis, who's a professor of ancient literature and myth, and he says the Gospels don't have the smell of myth about them, but still popularly that's what people think whenever they encounter the Gospels. And so what can we say about that? What do we do about that? You have to understand that one of the leaders of the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, was one of the great skeptics, and he wrote a book, Miracles, where he laid out what is still seen to be one of the definitive arguments against the possibility of miracles. There are really two heads to Hume's argument against miracles. There's the ontological one and there's the epistemological one. There's the one about miracles being impossible, because miracles are a violation of the laws of nature, which is impossible because there is no one outside the natural world to break them. So that's the ontological argument that he makes. Miracles break natural laws, which isn't possible. The second thing is epistemological, which is that basically, anyone who claims that they've ever seen a miracle, they can never prove it. So if you, and Hume's argument is just this wonderful circle where he says miracles are impossible because there is no supernatural. There is only natural laws. Miracles break natural laws, so miracles are impossible. And anyone who tells you that they've seen a miracle, so you need to consider that maybe you're wrong. Maybe there is a supernatural, but you can't really trust them anyway. So everyone knows that there is no supernatural, there is no God, so miracles are impossible. So it's just this wonderful, wonderful circle. It's very convenient. What do we say about that? Whenever I'm preaching, I'm dealing with Gospels and miracle stories, I always anticipate the objection here, because I know that people are going to switch off very, very early, and I don't want them to switch off. So I need to introduce early some arguments that will actually just make them stop and think, actually, okay, I'm still not sure about miracles, but they've thought this through. They've got reasons here that I can't completely dismiss. I lead with apologetics, even though my goal is gospel. And that there are some things that we could say that help challenge people to think about the possibility of miracles. And one is, well, just imagine for a moment that, well, it's as C.S. Lewis put it. Men became scientific because they expected to find laws in nature. And they expected to find laws in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Laws require lawgivers. The universe is an incredible mechanism. It requires a maker. The very fact that we have natural laws points to there being someone else, some mind, some intelligence behind the universe. And the maker of natural laws is not going to be bound by the laws that he makes. And so you just want to float that and just get people thinking, actually, just break through the box. They have this box says there is no supernatural. Just say, hold on, your box is governed by laws, but that says there's something outside the box, a lawgiver. Another thing to point out is that people in the Bible were not stupid and unscientific. This is what Lewis calls chronological snobbery, that we think that whenever they wrote about miracles, think, yeah, well, they misidentified things. They thought this was a miracle, but it really wasn't. It was this. We're so much more clever than they are, so much more enlightened, so much more advanced. We wouldn't be taken them by that silly stuff any longer. And that's just nonsense. One of the most incredible things about the gospel accounts is that they are so honest about the fact people struggle with miracles. Take Joseph, who I'm preaching on next Sunday. Joseph is angry whenever Mary comes and tells him that she's pregnant, because Joseph knows that babies don't come out of nowhere. Joseph knows the laws of nature. He knows about the birds and the bees. And he knows, Mary, you're pregnant, therefore you have been unfaithful, because I didn't get you pregnant, you have been unfaithful. Joseph isn't having it until the angel comes and speaks to him in the dream. And so just dispelling that, I think, is important to point out to people that, yeah, you find believing in miracles hard, so did they. I think that's really important to point out to people. Lewis also just has this great thought on miracles. His response to Hume is his book, Miracles. And Lewis just has this wonderful, wonderful quote, story, if you like, that just makes the point so well. He says, if this week I put £1,000 in the drawer of my desk, add £2,000 next week, and another 1,000 the week after, the laws of arithmetic allow me to predict the next time I come to my drawer, I shall find £4,000. Okay, £4,000 should be in the drawer. Then Lewis goes on and says, but suppose when I next open the drawer, I find only £1,000. What shall I conclude? That the laws of arithmetic have been broken? Certainly not. I might more reasonably conclude that some thief has broken the laws of the state and stolen £3,000 out of my drawer. Furthermore, it would be ludicrous to claim that the laws of arithmetic made it impossible to believe in the existence of such a thief or the possibility of his intervention. On the contrary, it is the normal workings of those laws that have exposed the existence and the activity of the thief. You see what he's saying? Yes, we believe fully in natural laws and that being the ordinary way that things work. But whenever you have evidence and accounts of something that breaks natural laws, that is making that you need to ask more questions and not just dismiss them out of hand and say, well, that's impossible. Rather, it indicates that someone has intervened. Again, William Lane Craig, the Christian philosopher, puts it that if you were to have an apple and you were to drop it, the law of gravity would say it would fall to the ground. But if you were to drop the apple and at the same time put your hand out here, the law of gravity still works, but it doesn't hit the ground. It lands in your hand because you have intervened. You've not broken natural law. The law of gravity is still working. It's just an agent has intervened. That's what's happening in the miracles of Jesus. That a supernatural power that is not bound by natural law, because it's the lawgiver, has intervened to reveal his presence. That's the quote, that the power of Jesus points to the person of Jesus, that God has revealed himself in the works of God performed at the hands of Jesus. So those are just some things that we can say to anticipate the objection and the struggle people will have whenever they encounter the historical documents about Jesus. They'll want to dismiss them as myth, but actually we can say, no, there are good reasons to say we need to think more here, because miracles are exactly what we'd expect to happen if there is someone who made the laws of nature. But we then need to come to the most important miracle of all. The Christianity, the entire gospel, hinges upon one miracle. You could say maybe two, that it's bounded by two miracles. There's the virginal conception of Jesus, but the one that we're going to think here about is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. A quickly thing on the virginal conception of Jesus, my friend Glenn Scrivener puts it, materialists believe in the virgin birth of the universe. Christians believe in the virgin birth of Christ. Choose your miracle. Very effective. The materialist also believes in virginal miracles. But the one that everything in Christianity hinges upon is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Apostle Paul puts this so clearly in 1 Corinthians 15, that if Jesus is not risen, your faith is in vain. It's all a lie. Chuck it in. Eat, drink, be merry, because tomorrow you may die. So go and have a good time. The resurrection is absolutely essential. It is a miracle, and everything rests upon it. Now, it's really important to bring at this point N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright has written one of the most important studies on the evidence for the resurrection. It's an 800-page book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. It's hard work. It repays the work invested in reading it. But he's gone through the historical sources in ancient literature, and one of the things that he really impresses upon us is just the the fact that the Christian church was born in a world. Well, here's the quote: Christianity was born in a world where its central claim was known to be false. The fact that dead people do not ordinarily rise is itself a part of early Christian belief, not an objection to it. Nobody in all the Greco-Roman world believed in the resurrection of the body. Nobody did. Absolute nonsense. What's more, they didn't want the resurrection of the body. They wanted this. Those who believed in any kind of afterlife believed it was the afterlife of the soul. And the greatest thing, salvation, was the escape of the soul from the body. The idea of the body and soul being resurrected, united together, that was nonsense. That was mad. They didn't want it. The Jews did believe in the resurrection of the body, but only on the last day of history. The Jews had no category for a resurrection of one person in the middle of history. That made no sense to them either. And what N.T. Wright points out is that the most astonishing thing about the early church is that they, from the earliest times, believed in the resurrection of one man in the middle of history. And they said that that changed everything. And that makes no sense whatsoever. That's not just something that you make up. That is bizarre. That is weird. That makes no sense unless it really happened. Even the disciples admit in the accounts, we didn't think he was going to be resurrected. We didn't know what he was talking about the 3 times he told us he was going to die and be raised. After Jesus died, they're in despair. They think it's all over. Even Thomas won't believe until he puts his hands in the nail prints. The early Christians, the first Christians, did not believe in the resurrection before it happened. And so what you've actually got is the miracle of the early church. The miracle of the early church, its birth, its growth, and its essential beliefs about the resurrection of Jesus and the future resurrection of Christians. You've got to explain that somehow. And it actually requires, John Lennox points out and says that it takes a bigger miracle to believe in the birth of the church than it does to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. Very interesting. So resurrection is at the heart of Christian belief from the earliest times. Resurrection is also something that people find hard to believe because it has only happened once. And it is not something that happens every day. And that is a stumbling block and a struggle for many people. And that's where then Richard Bauckham is so important when in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Exhaustive length, Bauckham makes the point that the Gospels that we have bear all the hallmarks of being eyewitness testimony from people who were really there and experienced these things. And Bauckham, early on in the book, makes the point about why eyewitness testimony is so important when it comes to Jesus. And he says that when you have events, when you have things that go beyond ordinary common experience, like miracles and the resurrection of them from the dead, you only can, the only way, because you will never encounter that in your ordinary experience, in your life, in your life experience or in the experience of your friends and family, the only access you have to those events, the exceptional, unique events, is through eyewitness testimony, people who were there. He uses the example of the Holocaust, and he points out, it is so difficult to believe in the Holocaust that one of the greatest nations, one of the most intellectual and culturally proud and prosperous and technologically advanced nations in the world, turned all that into a killing machine that killed upwards beyond 6 million people. The only way that you can really begin to fathom and accept the idea of the Holocaust is if you listen to the eyewitness testimony of all those who experienced it and what went on. And in the same way, the only way you'll begin to have access to consider the resurrection of Jesus is if you listen to the eyewitnesses who were there, who experienced it. The very claim of Christianity is that this is something that happened once, but it has repercussions for all the rest of time. The only way you're going to have access to this 2,000 years later is through the eyewitness testimonies, which is why it's so important that we have reliable access in the Bible to those testimonies. Now, in history, what we'd be interested in is we want to assess the historical evidence for the resurrection. There'd be some things that historians would be looking for, and that would be multiple independent eyewitnesses. You'd be looking to see what people who were not Christians had to say about the event. You'd be looking for things in the biblical account that you'd basically be looking for it not to be airbrushed, not to be whitewashed, for there to be embarrassing admissions that have the ring of truth about them, that they're recording what actually happened, not what they would have liked to have happened, Oh yeah, we all believe that Jesus was going to rise again from the dead. Yeah, we were never bothered. When he was on the cross and stuff, we were just sort of kicking back, having a great time, just knowing 3 days later, hey, resurrection day. No, that's not what happened. We'll do that one. And the last thing you'll be looking for is that the testimony of the eyewitnesses, that it was written down early, near in time, within living memory, within the lifetime of those who could oppose it and challenge it. It's interesting that we don't have, outside of the Quran, we don't have much evidence, we don't have really any evidence for the existence of Muhammad for over 150 years. Yet nobody thinks that Muhammad didn't exist. Yet we have evidence within 30 years of Jesus existing, and the same can go for multiple other historical figures. We don't have early evidence of their existing until hundreds of years after the events, and people accept that. The evidence we have for the resurrection is very, very, very early. Even before the first gospel is written down about the resurrection, the empty tomb, Mark's gospel, you have in Paul a full creed that we just read in 1 Corinthians 15 about the resurrection. Christianity from the earliest of times is recorded belief in the resurrection. Now, this is a diagram I've often used when I do this talk at universities. And I get this from Peter Kree's book on Christian apologetics. I came across this diagram about 10 years ago. I was just like, fabulous. This just captures things beautifully, wonderfully. And basically, we can be Sherlock Holmes. I always say that to people, that what we can do is we can be Sherlock Holmes and we consider the different explanations. So it is a historical, well, if we start from the bottom, the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most attested facts in all of ancient history. But from that point, things diverge. There are different theories of what happened next. The bottom option is Jesus didn't die. This is what sometimes called the swoon theory. This is particularly prominent in Islam. And the idea here is that Jesus, just after his, he awake all night, incredible stress, trial, flogging, bleeding, carrying the cross up the Via Dolorosa to Golgotha, the extreme stress and sweat and blood loss and fluid loss and exhaustion of crucifixion, that he fainted basically, that he fell into a deep coma. He appeared to ancient medicine to have died. They took him down, they put him in the tomb. But over the weekend, that in the cool of the tomb, he revived. And so people saw Jesus alive after the crucifixion because he just survived crucifixion. Now, there's a lot of things to be said about this. One is that people don't survive crucifixion. That's not how crucifixion works. I think there's only one ancient account in Josephus of a person surviving crucifixion. And that person was brought down early from the cross. They received, at Josephus's bequest, the best healthcare available from the Roman soldiers. And even then, I think after a period of weeks or maybe a couple of months, they died, succumbing to their injuries eventually. You don't come back from the cross. The cross is a death sentence. The Roman executioners, their lives depended on their successfully executing the prisoner. If the prisoner escaped, then they would forfeit their own lives. They had every reason to make sure Jesus was dead. That's why whenever they think, well, he's died rather early, let's make sure, they thrust the spear into his side. They want to make sure that he is dead because their lives depend upon it. The swoon theory doesn't make sense of the evidence. Plus, you've got to, but if you were to assume that the swoon theory was actually true, you have to believe a much more incredible set of events, which is Jesus bleeding, beaten, bruised, exhausted, that he somehow pushes the stone, that he fights off the Roman guards. He presents himself to his followers as the King of Glory, the Lord of Life, the Conqueror of Death, all without collapsing into a heap, a bloody mess. It's just not likely whatsoever. Swoon theory doesn't really work. So people are pretty convinced that Jesus really did die. He was crucified, but almost everyone agrees that. Most people agree he died. But then the vast majority of people would consciously or unconsciously believe Jesus didn't rise again. That's the next option. To which then there are two different theories to explain what happens next in the Gospels. The first option is that the apostles were deceived, that in their grief, in their sadness, they had a hallucination where they believed that that after some days that Jesus had come back to them, and they were so glad to see him again. And the contemporary stories we told, someone after someone's died, they feel a presence of a loved one who's departed, and they feel the presence, or they think they see them in places. And that's all this was. It was just a psychological delusion that the apostles had. A number of things to be said about that. First thing is that we said earlier that the apostles didn't have a box for the bodily resurrection of Jesus. As Jews, they believed in the resurrection of all people at the end of time, but they had no box for the resurrection of one person in the middle of time. If they were going to see Jesus after his crucifixion and death, it would be much more likely that they would see him in glory in heaven. That's what their cultural mindset and imagination would go to. That's how their hallucination would work. But the idea of him being in a body on earth, they just don't have a category for that. It doesn't make any sense that they would hallucinate that. Another thing is that it's not just that you've got, it is possible for individuals to have a hallucination, grief-stricken psychological hallucination. But how do you explain multiple people having the same hallucination at different times and places? That doesn't make a lot of psychological sense. What do you make of Jesus doing physical things? Making fires, cooking breakfast, eating fish, doing things, being touchable. Mary touched him, hugged him. Thomas touched him. And even more so, the evidence for having, it is possible in certain rare circumstances to have a corporate a corporate hallucination, because Paul tells us that Jesus not just appeared to the apostles, but also appeared to more than 500 people at one time. Want to know more about that event? The Gospels don't tell us much about that. Paul tells us about that. Paul's saying, go and ask the people who were there. But again, it doesn't make much sense. It doesn't really fit psychologically. So it's very unlikely the apostles were deceived by a grief-stricken hallucination. That doesn't make sense. Plus, another thing, a hallucination doesn't empty the tomb. Remember, everyone agrees the tomb is empty on Easter Sunday morning. The question is, how did it get emptied? If the apostles were deceived by a hallucination, all the Jews and Romans had to do was say, see the body? No, you're wrong. That didn't happen. So that takes us on to the next possibility, which is the apostles were themselves deceivers. Now, the reason that the tomb was empty on Easter Sunday morning was because they had engaged in a vast conspiracy to raid the tomb, fight off the Roman guards, and fake the resurrection. Again, why would they do that? Why would they invent the resurrection from the dead whenever their own Jewish contemporaries didn't believe in it, and whenever the entire world around them thought it was nonsense and undesirable? You wouldn't invent that kind of religion. It might be that you go on and you would make a martyr of Jesus and say, right, let's rise up against the Romans now because they've crucified the Messiah. Let's get our revenge, but not to create a religion which is centered on resurrection. That doesn't make any sense. The apostles also didn't gain anything by their invention. Like some people think, they're like the Benny Hinns of this world. They go around flying in their private jets in their white Armani suits, living the high life, having a great time, comfortable. But no, the apostles lost everything for Jesus, even their own lives. Eventually, they were martyred for their testimony about the resurrection of Jesus. Why? People die for lies all the time, but people don't die whenever they've invented the lie themselves and they've got the chance to admit, yeah, I made it up. It's not real. It's not true. No, they went to their death boldly, courageously, fearlessly, because they believed in the resurrection of Jesus. They believed that as he had risen, they would rise. You see, when you go through the alternatives to the resurrection of Jesus, that he didn't die, or that he didn't rise and the apostles were deceived or were deceivers, when you go through all the different scenarios, they cannot account for what really happened. They cannot account for the evidence that we have. It doesn't make any sense, any of these alternative theories. The only thing that makes sense of all the evidence that we have and the events the events, most notably the empty tomb. Everyone agrees the tomb is empty. Everybody agrees the tomb is empty. Everyone agrees that the apostles claimed to see Jesus after his death. These are two incontrovertible historical facts that everyone agrees on. The only two things that make sense of them is the first option, which is that Christianity is true, that Jesus died and that he rose again. N.T. Wright says, you know, a tomb without a body would be a mystery, and an appearance, what does he put it? An appearance after death could be taken as a hallucination. But when you have an empty tomb and you've got appearances together, you have the makings for the good news, the gospel, that Jesus is the conqueror of death and the savior from sin, whose consequence is death. A couple of years ago, I came across Charles Foster, who's a barrister in England at the Crown Court, part-time judge as well. And he's written this book called the Jesus Inquest. And as a former lawyer myself, I'm always interested when lawyers engage with the evidence for the resurrection. And in wonderful, typical understatement, he says at the conclusion of his book, the Jesus Inquest, where he goes through all the different theories. What he does in the book is he goes through all of the all the evidence, and then all the sort of objections, all the alternatives to the resurrection, and then he presents the counter case. That's what a barrister does. They often will prepare the case against them and then their own case in response to it. And he does that for the resurrection beautifully, wonderfully, compellingly. He has this conclusion that merely historical evidence for the resurrection is very good. The historical resurrection is easily the most probable explanation for all the data we have. You do have to believe some remarkable things if you don't believe the resurrection. I don't have the faith to believe those things. Astonishing. So, Jesus really lived. He really died. With a very high degree of probability, he rose again. And your faith is not in vain. And the impact that Jesus and his followers have made on the world is incontrovertible. So, that's exciting. That's good news. We can rejoice in these things. We can gain great confidence in these things. So you've done really well listening for the last hour. Do you want to ask any questions, follow up anything, seek any clarifications, argue back?
There's a book that I found quite helpful. It's quite simple, but Peter Williams is quite good, I find, on it. So, Can We Trust the Gospels? It's only it's quite a short book. It's 140 pages. It's quite accessible. But I listened to Peter Williams at Charlotte Chapel about 10 years ago, talking about defending the Gospels. But he's really good to read, Peter Williams. So I'd suggest that book as well.
Yeah, excellent book. He's the provost at Tyndale House, so excellent scholar. Actually reads the original manuscript. Well, not the original manuscript, all the copies. So he's an expert.
I think one of the recommended reading as well, you had The Case for Christ, was it? No, the Case, Lee Strobel.
Yeah.
And is it Case for Christ or Case for the Resurrection? That he kind of goes through the evidence that you've been through as well. And that again is from a journalist perspective. He's a journalist, is that right? So it's journalist perspective. But it's pretty clear as well as to
So put Strobel on your reading list as recommended. So Strobel is sort of a really good introductory book. And what's really good about Strobel is that, as you say, Peter, he's a journalist, was a journalist. His story is his wife became a Christian and he was outraged at this and he wanted to convince her that she was wrong and get her back. So he set out to disprove Christianity, particularly by attacking the evidence for Jesus and the resurrection. And in the process, he convinced himself it was true. Funny that. And then he goes on in his book and he interviews some of the world-leading scholars and professors who are experts on all the different aspects of the historical evidence for Jesus and the resurrection and the Gospels and the New Testament documents. And you've just got an introduction there just to some of the 5 or 6 top people in the world who are experts in these things. and it's written very, very accessibly. It's a story, a conversation of each person, and it's very compelling introductory book. I definitely recommend it. It's it's one you could easily give away to someone who was interested, a friend who wasn't a Christian, who wanted to look more into things. Absolutely a giveaway one. Convinced? Believe Jesus is real?
Amen.
Excellent. Ian's not convinced. I've seen him nod his head. Can't see the other Ian, but hopefully he agrees. We should be encouraged. He's not convinced. I've not convinced him. I've not convinced him. It's the pain talking, Ian. It's the medication you're on.
I was convinced before, David.
Excellent. Hopefully there's even more reasons to be convinced now. I think it's a good wee lecture to finish on. But what we're going to do now is we're going to move over and give you the last demonstration talk. Get the screen. Now, this talk was one of the last that I did at Glasgow University back in February, before the world went mad, for their missions week. We did a week on the entitled Purpose, searching for purpose, and we looked at different facets of what it means to have a life of purpose. And this I think this was the middle talk of the week, was actually just on purpose itself. And the question associated with purpose is, how can I make a difference? That seems to be the burning question, particularly for young people of that generation. I want to say my generation, but even I'm moving beyond the right of to call myself that generation as I get older. So how can I make a difference? That's the theme for this talk. This would be, if you like, closely related to a talk on the meaning of life. It's just a slightly different way of approaching it. And what I'm trying to do through this talk is I want to introduce the idea that the resurrection of Jesus changes how we view human history and our place in it. This isn't in the talk, but I'll give it to you. In the ancient world, if there was a picture of history, it would be a circle, or maybe waves, like sine graph, recurrence, round and round and round. There was no idea of progress, instead of just this eternal recurrence. The universe was eternal, matter was eternal. It's Ecclesiastes, time to live, time to die, time for this, time for that. Just the wheel of life just goes round and round and round. Christianity came along and changed that. The whole idea that we have in the West of progress, of making a difference, of being on the right side of history, all of those ideas are actually Christian ideas, and they were revolutionary in the ancient world. Various scholars, various histories of thought that would corroborate that. And so what I'm trying to do in this talk is I'm wanting to introduce people to the idea of saying that desire, that burning desire and passion you have for justice, that burning desire you have for a better world, for making a difference, your life counting, that burning desire that you have is a Christian desire. Did you know that? It's a Christian desire, and it can only be made possible through Jesus. So get on board with Jesus and you will find the fulfillment of your heart's desire. That's the idea for the talk. So let's get stuck in. Everyone wants their life to matter. We want to be part of some cause or some story that is bigger than ourselves. I think that's why many people talk about wanting to be on the right side of history when they're talking about climate change or fighting for social justice. What they're saying is they want to make a difference in this world. We want to leave it a better place than how we found it when we arrived. But to believe that we can really make a difference assumes something about the nature of this world and the shape of its history. It's not just a practical issue, it's a philosophical issue. For example, when former President Barack Obama was out campaigning for social progress, reform and justice in the United States, He often repeated this mantra: the moral arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. His point was that it will take time for change to happen, but it will. We'll get there. Just don't give up. Keep fighting for it all the long way. The question is, how could Barack Obama, indeed, how could any of us be sure that that statement is true? How can we be sure that history is shaped or bent towards justice rather than injustice? You see, on the contrary, many skeptics tell us that history has been written by the victors. And if they're right, then the arc of history is defined by what is by might, not what is right. It is the strong and the powerful who write the script of the future. There is no hope of inevitable progress and final justice for the poor, for the oppressed, for the marginalized, just for the elites. However, what's really interesting is that Barack Obama was actually quoting someone else when he said this. He was quoting the words of celebrated civil rights activist, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Luther King preached, the moral arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And immediately afterwards, he justified that belief by saying, I believe the Bible. Luther King believed that history was going somewhere, that it will culminate in the day of judgment when God will vindicate all that is just, right, true, good, and beautiful against the forces of evil. That is the Bible's story. It ends in a garden city, in a new world of peace and justice and happiness, where there will be no more sickness, pain, or death. Now, our secular society likes how that story ends, but the problem is that it believes it can get there without God, that we can build up the heavenly city on earth rather than wait for it to come down from God. That through human intelligence, through scientific innovation, we will progressively create a better world in which we'll live all together happily ever after. But as we're going to see in a couple of minutes, not everyone is confident that such a utopian story is true. You see, when we think about the shape of history, there are three main shapes or three main stories that people tell about history and its future. We're going to look at each of them and assess them. The first story is that life is a tragedy. In a Shakespearean sense, tragedy is a story shaped by characters that are built up and then torn down. A tragedy inevitably ends with dead bodies and funerals. I have to tell you that I believe that an atheistic view of life will necessarily be shaped as a tragedy. If you don't believe me, listen to one of the most articulate British atheists of the last century, Bertrand Russell. He once wrote, "Man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end that they were achieving. His origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of an accidental collocation of atoms. No fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. All the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. And the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins." Somebody needs to get Bertrand Russell a Happy Meal with some extra happy. Life is a tragedy. I think if you're an atheist, then you will find it very hard to resist that conclusion. Nevertheless, not all atheists are as despairing about life before death, before the death of the solar system. There is another story, and that is that life is an ascent. Some people believe that this better describes the course of history. Their theme tune might be, things can only get better. For example, take Harvard professor Steven Pinker. He's one of the world's leading optimistic humanists. His best-selling book, Enlightenment Now, is filled with graphs and statistics that demonstrate all the ways that our lives today are better, safer, longer, and healthier than ever before. And he attributes all of this human progress to the engine of the Enlightenment, with its rejection of God and belief in the supernatural. Pinker tells the story of human history in 3 words: entro, evo, info. Entropy, evolution, information. The story goes that although the universe is naturally governed by the process of entropy, the process of increasing disorder and chaos, through the process of evolution, resulting in the human brain, we now have the tools of science to resist entropy, to harness the potential of the world, to bring order, and to craft a greater destiny for ourselves. That is the next step of the evolutionary ascent of man, to take control of our own destiny. Intro, Evo, Info. Sounds exciting. However, not all of Pinker's atheist colleagues agree with him. For example, philosopher John Gray, one of my favorite atheists, wrote this devastating and exposing review. The humanist belief in progress is only a secular version of the Christian faith. To believe in progress is to believe that by using the new powers given us by growing scientific knowledge, humans can free themselves from the limits that frame the lives of other animals. This is the hope of nearly everyone nowadays, but is groundless. For though human knowledge will very likely continue to grow, and with it human power, the human animal will stay the same, a highly inventive species that is also one of the most predatory and destructive. Now, I think that John Gray is a bit closer to reality than Steven Pinker is. You see, if Pinker is right, if humans are simply animals in the process of evolution, then why should we fight entropy rather than simply embrace the chaos? Why should we prioritize sympathy for others over our own selfish survival? You see, why should we? Pinker can't tell you why. He would like you to, but he can't tell you why you should. Instead, I want to suggest to you that the greatest engine that has driven human progress across the centuries is not the story of the atheistic Enlightenment. Rather, it is the story, the Judeo-Christian story of the Bible. That's something that even a secular historian like Tom Holland has recognized. That so many of our values, so many of the developments that we take for granted here in the Western world, they are driven and drawn from the well of Christianity. It is that far older story that has guided the development of our values of human rights, equality, democracy, reason, and science. And it is the Bible that gives us hope that our lives do not have to end in tragedy, in the vast death of the solar system. Instead, the Bible presents a third story, third shape, if you like, that life is a comedy. Now, this is again in a Shakespearean sense. A comedy describes a story that ends in a wedding, where all the bad things that happen to the characters in the story are made right, where everyone lives happily ever after. That is the shape of the Bible story. It's a story of a very good beginning, a terrible fall into sin, a dramatic turning point concerning the person and work of Jesus Christ, and a glorious ending that his resurrection from the dead has made possible. The Bible finishes, as they know of every true comedy, with a wedding, the wedding of God and his people, the wedding of heaven and earth. And at the center of the Bible story is the person of Jesus Christ. Not just the center of the Bible story, but the center of all of human history that's been divided into AD and BC by his coming. Now, once Jesus told a story or a parable about a wedding. This story consists of 3 scenes. In the first scene, we're introduced to a king who's preparing a great banquet to celebrate his son's wedding. No cost has been spared. He's been to Waitrose, not just Aldi. In advance, he's invited all of his friends to come. And some of you know just how much work it is to organize a wedding. Then when everything is ready, he calls his guests to come in and enjoy the feast. However, one after another, they rudely refuse to come, making all sorts of ridiculous excuses. In this shame and honor society, their behavior is completely unacceptable. It brings shame and disgrace upon the king. Under the guise of this parable, Jesus is alluding to how in just a matter of days, he, the Son of God, the King, would be rejected and crucified by the very people whom God had promised the Messiah to and invited into his kingdom. In the second scene, we're told how the king graciously responds to this outrageous offense. He instructs his servants to go out into the streets and invite anyone else they can. Specifically, we're told that both the bad as well as the good are invited to come in. And this is Jesus looking ahead to beyond his resurrection from the dead, the time whenever the invitation of the gospel will go out to the rest of the world. But then in the final scene, we witness the interaction of the king with one of the guests. We're told that this guest was not wearing wedding clothes. Now, if you're anything like me, then you've probably been told many times, you're not going out looking like that, or you can't go there wearing that. I don't have the best fashion sense. Maybe you can identify with that. But that's not the situation here. Instead, in ancient times, a very wealthy host would be expected to not just provide the food and venue, but also the formal clothes for the wedding guests. But for some reason, this guest has refused to wear the clothes that have been provided for the occasion, and as a result, he's thrown out. Now, what are we to take from all of this? Well, Jesus tells us that if you want to enjoy the eternal celebration of heaven and earth, then you need two things. Firstly, you need an invitation, and secondly, you need a wedding garment. And there's good news on both counts. First, God wants you to come in and enjoy the party. He invites us all to come in. That's why Jesus extends this invitation earlier in Matthew's Gospel. Come to me, all of you who are weak and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Whoever you are, wherever you come from, whatever the color of your skin, whatever your bank balance, whatever your educational attainments or not, no matter how good or how even bad you are, Jesus invites you to come in and join the wedding of heaven and earth. But the news gets even better. Because secondly, God is the one who provides the necessary wedding garment. That corrects a misunderstanding that many people have, who think that they need to sort themselves out and clean up their act before they can come to God and be found acceptable in his sight. But that's like thinking you have to make yourself better before you make an appointment to go and see the doctor. No, instead the Bible says that we are all sick, that we all need a cure that only God can provide. And this parable shows us that what God requires from us has been provided for us by Jesus. Jesus is the one who has purchased and provided the wedding garments for us to wear to his wedding. This parable warns us that we cannot be accepted in God's sight on the basis of what we do, clothed in our own good works, good intentions. We only can be accepted on the basis of what Jesus has done instead for us. You see, in his humanity, Jesus has lived the God-pleasing life that we have failed to live. In his death, Jesus has suffered the penalty that our God-dishonoring sins deserve. And in Jesus' resurrection from the dead, Jesus marks the turning point of all of human history. I love what the resurrection of Jesus means. I love how what Mike Cain says about the significance of the resurrection of Jesus means for our lives today, our activism, how we can make a difference. He writes, the resurrection means that all that we do in this world is not going to be undone by death. Because the king will bring justice, justice matters today. Because the king will bring harmony, the way we treat people matters today. Because the king will renew the creation, caring for the planet matters today. So here's the good news. Each and every one of you is invited to enjoy the wedding of heaven and earth, God and his people. The only question is, how are you going to RSVP? So there you go. That to me is a simple talk, and I like that one. The resurrection really makes a difference to our lives and to the shape of human history, our understanding of how we fit into the story. Especially it tells us that not everything that we do will be undone by death. It's the answer to the problem of Ecclesiastes. The writer of Ecclesiastes, he despairs. Futile, futile, everything is futile. But Paul tells us in view of the resurrection that creation was subjected to futility, but in hope for the revealing of the sons of God, Romans 8. The resurrection brings hope and gives meaning and direction to our lives now and forever. So there you go. There is our last talk. We've got some time left. So I want to hear from you. I'd like to hear from all of you. Love to hear your voices. Look back over the last was it 9 weeks we've had together, 10 weeks, including your reading week. Think back over this course, some of the things that you've heard, some of the things that you've read in your own time, so maybe some things you've discovered in doing your assignment, and just I'd love just to hear from each of you, if possible, how has this course helped you? What difference has it made, if any? And if you have any other questions or issues you want to bring up and ask while you've got me, feel free to do that as well. So I'd just love to hear your reflections. So just take it in turns and speak up.
I've really enjoyed this course, David. Quite a few in my family are either Catholics or not non-believers. There's not many believers in my family, and so I found this course is giving me the tools to be able to approach them now in different ways than I've tried in the past, and has given me some more confidence to argue certain points as well now. So I've found it really, really helpful. Thank you very much.
So Rabbi Zacharias just died there in the summer, but as he always said, that we're never just out to win arguments, and we're never just out to answer questions, but always we're trying to speak to a questioner. That's one of those sort of rules of thumb, that we're always out to win and reach the person. So hopefully, as you say, and the tools will help as you endeavor to do that with love and with prayer and with having the courage to open your mouth. Well done.
You know, there's some in my family, it doesn't matter what arguments I'm going to use, because their default is Christianity is stupid. So they've closed their minds off. So I'm not going to get through to some of them. I know that, but at least it's given me tools to hopefully get through to some others in the family.
Great. All for tools.
I think one of the main things I've learned from you, David, is that I suffer from a thing that if somebody's saying something that I intensely disagree with, I usually end up thinking, how can that person be so stupid? And I'll give them the right answer that they're looking for. But you've taught us over this last 8-9 weeks, and you've said, listen to the person, listen to what they're saying, ask them questions, and then make your judgment. So that's the one thing I've learned from you, is not to jump in with both feet, but to actually listen and try and understand them. So that's been a great help to me.
I mean, I think you've got that more from Andy Ballister than from me, because I suffer from the same sickness. So I'm still learning that one. And hopefully, and you've done this course before, you did this course several years ago, and hopefully it's better this time. Hopefully you see the difference that 5-6 years of being out in the field doing this, hopefully it's a lot better than what you went through last time. So thanks for your patience and coming back.
Well, I wouldn't say it's better. I'd say that this is the kind of course that every 4 or 5 years you should repeat, mainly just because you do forget things you've learned, but it reinforces, because there's new technology out there which wasn't on the go 4 or 5 years ago. So it's updating all the time. So I would suggest to everybody that this is the kind of thing you should repeat every 4 or 5 years.
This puts more pressure on. I have to do it better again in 5 years.
I found it really interesting. I've really enjoyed it. You've covered a lot of ground in your 9 weeks, so brilliant for that. Thank you. It's been more probably, I found, theoretical than practical, perhaps, but that's a good thing, because it's preparing us to face the questions that will be asked and things like that. So there's a lot we've been through, as I say. So I've printed out all the stuff. So in time, I'm keen to review it and things like that. But the first week, I think you covered the model of cultural apologetics, which I think our assignment's going to be based around. Is that right? Yeah. And so that I found really practical. And there are other sessions I just found really interesting, because you covered a lot of topical grounds, and in particular, I had a sort of bereavement, or sort of in the middle of it type thing. It was quite helpful in that regard. So I think I'm probably going to, given what's happened, probably align my assignment around that sort of question of the problem of suffering and evil, just because it's sort of there's a sort of a personal element to it as well that I've perhaps experienced.
And see the theoretical side of this as being a preparation for practical. If you like, a lot of what we've done is we have You know how if you go out for a walk in the countryside, you can find paths there are some paths which are quite light. There's not been walked over much, but you can just sort of see there's obviously a path here, but it's not. And there are other paths which are very clearly worn through. If you like, what we've done mentally and intellectually and theoretically is we have started to wear some paths in your mind, saying you might enter this field on a walk. You might meet someone in this field, or you might get across this field. This is the field of suffering, the question and problem of suffering. And here are some paths through this, and you can start walking through them in your mind. If you have thought through the things before, you may not remember anything that I've said. This is really important. You may not remember any of the facts, the evidence, the quotes, the ideas that I've told you, but because your mind has walked through that field once before, it will hopefully find it easier to find the path and journey that way again. And the more you go down that path on your own after this course, just the more worn it will be. So hopefully, just what we hopefully the theoretical stuff prepares your mind then for when you're in the actual real life situation to respond. And above all, the Holy Spirit's the one in the live moments who is helping us, bringing things back to mind. You also mentioned about cultural apologetics. Book read last week. I think my display is back to front from what you see it, but telling a better story, how to talk about God in a skeptical age. This book is basically the first lecture and my whole approach to Acts 17 apologetics and loads of the demonstration talks that I've done. It's basically in a book. This is the first time I've come across a book that in a oneer practically and theoretically lays out all the stuff that we've covered and we're talking about. It's not too thick, it's written really well. Telling a Better Story by Joshua Chatraw. Telling a Better Story. If you were to get one book if you want to go and do this more practically, but building on all the things we've covered theoretically, this is an excellent, excellent book. Particularly what is helpful about it is that it's recognizing that the way to do this is the way we can get through people today is by helping them to see Christianity is the better story. Not just it's got the better arguments and the better facts and the better figures and the better philosophers, but actually it's the better story, and that deeply resonates with things in our hearts and our minds. Ian, you were talking about people in your family, they're just not interested, just that they're closed-minded, but there's still these deep desires in their hearts, like we just did in that demo talk. Desire to make a difference. Did you know that your desire to make a difference, to make a better world, that's a Christian desire? Did you know that? You didn't. Christianity is a better story that makes sense of your deepest desires. Just Chatraw's book, Telling a Better Story, How to Talk About God in a Skeptical Age, is excellent. Everybody that I've read and cited to you in this course, they're in the footnotes. So I'm like, this is it. This guy is basically my brain. It's amazing. So I'm far better. He expresses things much more clearly and much more helpfully and much more productively than I do. So Telling a Better Story is well worth a Christmas book buying. I get no royalties for any of the books I recommend. I've missed a trick there.
I've really enjoyed the course, David. It strengthened my own faith, I think, as well, and gave me confidence to engage with people. Kind of similar to Ian, my family, to me, we're on different wavelengths. And I always struggle how do I kind of communicate the gospel to them, but like the other aim was then ask questions. It's so simple, but just ask questions, see where they're coming from, and hopefully be able to have more fruitful kind of conversations with them. So I found it really, really good.
Yeah, it talks about the the penknife of questions. There's 3 penknife questions already. So tell me some more about that, or why do you believe that? What do you mean by that? How did you come to think that way? So sorts of questions. Andy's talk you can get online for free easily, half-hour talk. How to talk about Jesus without looking like an idiot, which is going to be the basis of his next book that he's writing, coming out in a year or so. How to talk about Jesus without looking like an idiot is all about that. In Andy's inimitable, entertaining, engaging style. So if you want to go more. Another thing as well, just what you're saying there, just about your own confidence, Steph, thinking about the coronavirus vaccine that we're hearing about, the whole idea of a vaccine is that you introduce your body to your immune system to something, so it sort of has it gets used to it, so that whenever it encounters the real thing in the real world, it's ready, it knows, it recognizes it, and is able to attack it and kill it. That's the whole idea of a vaccine. I feel like apologetics is a vaccine for your faith. You're going to encounter doubts, objections, unbelief, apathy in the world everywhere we go, especially as the days continue on before the Lord's return, as we continue on the path of secularism, returning to neo-paganism. This course is a vaccination for that, to make your spiritual immune system stronger, more confident, more resilient for the days to come. And there's no needles involved, just lots of books.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this. And I think the thing that you said which most helped me was the idea of the closed-handed and the open-handed apologetics, which I suppose it's similar to what you're saying about telling a better story, but just think conversations in the past where I've sort of just tried to defend Christianity and just said, why I think something's wrong, and it kind of just has the effect of making more ostracizing people or making people angry. But I think even in your talks, when you've just sort of just showed how Christianity looks at this in a better way than culture does, I found that really helpful for myself. So I just think that whole approach has been helpful for me.
Chatter's book just does it better, Joel. Is any of this working its way into your sermons?
Well, I found it interesting. You were saying in sermons you always try to bring these questions up, because I think in a way I'm hesitant, because I think and you're probably in a different context, you probably have more students and that kind of thing. I'm in a bit of a elderly town, but I think sort of Christians expect you just to give sort of a straightforward, message from the Bible, and I'm never sure how much of these sort of things to put into sermons, so I just wondered your thoughts on that, really.
Yeah, every context is different, and it's not, for me, it's not every sermon. I guess the person who's really influenced me when I think about this is Tim Keller, and he talks about how, let's imagine you're preaching every week for a month. Maybe one of the four, you might bring in what he calls an apologetics sidebar, where there's something in the passage, there's an issue, or there's something it talks about, or it touches on an issue, and you're saying, now that issue, as we read that today, that's a very difficult thing, isn't it? We struggle with that, don't we? And in that moment, what you're doing is you're the people who are in front of you, who are probably mostly Christians, what you're doing is you are equipping them to deal with this when they're out there in the world. So you're serving them for ministry to their neighbors and friends. But also, this is one of Charles Taylor's insights from week 1, that all of us in a secular age are affected by doubt. Yeah, we're believers, but we also are far more exposed to doubt than ever before. There is a fragility to even our faith that was not there in past days, because we know that our faith is one of many and that it's under a tremendous attack. And even though we have got great confidence, it's still under attack. And so you're actually helping your congregation by just helping them think through the issue. But thirdly, another thing is accomplished by you doing that little apologetic sidebar, and that's people think to themselves, I wish that my friend is, I've heard my colleague at work's talk to me about that, and I've never known what to say. I wish my friend had been here to hear the answer, or to hear how you approach that. And you're just building up people's confidence to bring a friend along to you whenever you're going to do a different event, an evangelistic event or something like that. People will actually think, I could bring my friend here, and this would engage with them. And so it's more of a long-term strategy, Joel, that you build this into your ministry, and you just do it just like sprinkling. and it just builds over time, and you'll grow. It'll build inside you and your own confidence in doing it, much more naturally in doing it. And then basically you're always just assuming when you're right, whenever you're dealing with passage, somebody just think, what's a non-Christian hearing right now? Oh, Jesus walks on water. What's a non-Christian hearing in that moment? Just have that person in your mind and just think, what would I? It could just be a sentence, or it could be an apologetic sidebar. You might work your way up to where you have them like we do now, once a month, a service where it's in themes just for guests. With the talks I do in demos, they're either university talks or those guest night talks. Q&A time afterwards, you might manage to get there, build up to doing that, and just building a culture. Basically, you're building a culture in a church where you say, we've all got questions. The world's got questions. The Bible and the Gospel's got the answers. It's got the goods. It's got the better story. So let's get to it. Does that help?
Yeah. What do you mean by a sidebar? Just sort of like a bit of a tangent.
A wee bit. Yeah, a wee bit. It depends on the issue. It's like miracles. To even just acknowledge now the idea that Jesus walking on water. Now, I know what you're thinking. I know what some of you are thinking. That just doesn't sound very believable, does it? Have you ever tried to walk on water? Do you know what happens when you put your foot in water? Have you done it? Have you been down to the seaside? What happens when you put your foot in the water? So go on, you build up the story. Something happens here, and you might be tempted to think, this is just myth, this is just legend, this is just nonsense, this is just fairy tales, it's just made up. But don't switch off, because what Jesus is doing here is he is demonstrating something about who he is, about his power, that he is not subject to the natural laws of this world in the same way that you and I are, because of who he is. He is the lawgiver, the one who created the seas, who gave them their constituency, and he is able to suspend or interrupt those laws at this point and walk on water. And the key thing in the story then is that Jesus is going to pass by. When Jesus is walking across the Lake Galilee, he says it's his intention to pass by the disciples. There's a biblical resonance there of Moses, Sinai, passing by, Elijah on the mountain of Sinai, passing by. Jesus wants to pass by, reveal who he is to the disciples, and that's what's the key point. So it's not biblically a tangent. The whole point is he's passing by, revealing his glory, revealing his identity. But you've just put in this little sidebar here that don't dismiss this. Yes, this doesn't seem believable, but it is plausible when you consider that the very claim here is that Jesus is the lawgiver. Do you see? That's just off the cuff an example. You've not taken 10 minutes, you've not quoted secular people, you've not gone into the science stuff, but you've just acknowledged that there's a question here that our culture would have, that someone who's not a committed Christian would be asking. And that just helps people, I think.
I suppose if you're going, like we've just gone through Luke's gospel, but you'd be doing that every week about miracles, wouldn't you? So
yeah. That's why you sort of decide, we'll do once a month, maybe. But when we get to the resurrection, we're going to do a sermon on it. We're going to think about just we're going to do a whole sermon where we're going to look at, or at least half of the sermon on the resurrection, we're going to think about just the evidence, the apologetics around about the resurrection, and then think about the implications of the resurrection.
Yeah, maybe I need to work on that then.
Well, set yourself a challenge that at some point in the next quarter, you're going to try an apologetic sidebar in one of your messages. Just when it comes up, just when it's something in the text, you think, if a non-Christian was hearing that or listening to this message, what would be the thing they'd be asking right now? What would be and hopefully some of the stuff in the course you'll be able to just pull out a few sentences or an illustration or an idea and just use it, even if it's just a few sentences or maybe a couple of minutes. No pressure, just a challenge. Every confidence you'll do well.
I thank you too, David, for these last 9 weeks, and it's really embedded in me quite a good stuff. It's really I've got a structure and a skeleton now, But even I've just been looking over the actual, the text, 1 Peter 3:16 or 3:15. You see, if you read before it, it says suffering for righteousness' sake, right? It says, now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if I should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your heart regard Christ the Lord as holy. Always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason, for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. And see this, just the way this is all backed it up, that, and I mean, I've got a framework now, and when I'm talking to people now, I'm not so, I can't think of the word, I'm not so bombastic in a sense. I can stand back, I can listen to them, and I can reply. And I've got into a habit now. I remember you saying something about, was it floating stones on logs, right? And I always when I depart from somebody, I always impart something, if you know what I mean. I always manage just now to drop something in, and just wait for it to come back in me the next time I see them, just get them thinking. And so it's even sometimes when people come out with things and I just challenge them now. And I'm not doing it for an argument's sake. I'm not a debater or anything, but I'll sort of turn around now and say, well, why do you believe that? And they just accept it. Yeah, I'm just a Christian who's to keep quiet and just go on with things, right? But if you are living righteously and you're rubbing up against people because you're living differently, you are going to get questioned, you are going to get challenged. And I'm starting to get challenged on things. But it gives you that opportunity, just to retell where I am now and where I was, and I think it was the better house or something, or I've got it written down somewhere. And but it's just, I'm just in such a better place now. And this, obviously, I'll go back and read it, and it obviously it could be used even in a discipleship sense. But it's just the fact that I'm not even, see, in a sense, you'd be embarrassed, not embarrassed, but if somebody asks you, oh no, right? But now I'm not embarrassed or anything, because I'm in a sort of place where I can just on my level, just return to them, and not get flustered or frustrated. And they'll say, but it's 10 million zillion years. And I'm like, well, show me where it says that, and I'll show you where it says that. So, I mean, it gets you in a place, a solid place, and it was identify, persuasion, or I can't think.
Identification, persuasion, and
persuasion, right? But the persuasion
I know
thing
where you live. It's an awful place to live.
Yeah.
But when you live in this wonderful new house.
And the one I'll remember and laugh at if I'm just walking down the street, going for a bus, whatever, is was it the Goldilocks zone? See, when you said that, and that just cracked me up, because, if I'm standing with somebody and they're going on a bit, and I'll just be like, the Goldilocks zone, we just live in this world that's not too hot, not too cold, it's just right. And it's great because you not that you're laughing at them, but when you know the truth, there's no point in panicking, is there?
That's it. Whenever you have a settled confidence in the Word of God and the Gospel and its truth and reality, and its plausibility, I think the reason why people get angry is whenever they're insecure, because they're fighting, they're threatened, and they're fighting. But if you're not threatened, if you have been forced to look at the hard things and think them through, and you may not be able to regurgitate any answers at all, but I know I've looked at this, I know I've read about this, I know I've listened to lectures about this, I know there's answers to this. I can't reproduce the answers to you. I'll come back to you maybe and bring you some stuff you can go listen to or read for yourself, or I'll write down, I'll go away and write it down and bring it to you. But I'm not threatened. I'm happy just to have the conversation with you, listen to what you're saying. I'm not threatened because I'm confident in this. I think that's what you're testifying to, Peter, and that's part of the aim. The twofold aim of this course is to equip you so that you would be able to testify and to have confidence in speaking and defending the truth and presenting the gospel as the better story in a culture that doesn't think it is. good news at all. But even if you don't go and do that, I will be very happy to settle for you and yourself having a firm, confident, built up faith that just means you're settled. Holding on to the Lord Jesus, knowing in yourself that he is my Lord. And I'll do my best to answer with gentleness and respect and give an answer as best as I can. And we'll all have different abilities and different skills, different ways of doing that. That's absolutely fine. But if you have that settled faith that I've set apart the Lord in my heart, I've set apart Jesus in my heart as Lord. And I have the answers in me, even if I can't give them the answers or you the answers. I have the answer in me. Take that any day. Let me pray. It's been lovely to spend these weeks with you and share with you the inside of my head. And oh, Peter, yep.
Yeah, but to just touch a little bit on the assignment just before we finish. Or do you want to pray first and then do that?
That's fine. So the assignment, the idea was, you've seen me now do 7 of the 9 lectures. You've seen me do a sort of demonstration talk every time. Identification, persuasion, invitation, following Paul's pattern in Acts. The idea of the assignment was to make you do a talk, basically, or rather than an essay, get you just to do some sort of talk. I've suggested that you choose an issue or question that's to do with, well, I've suggested if you can't think of a question, apologetics question or issue, that you look at the contents page of one of the apologetics books and pick a question that you're interested in looking into from there. I want to see you finding, I want to see you doing identification. I want to see you finding a cultural way in to begin getting people to introducing the issue in a culturally appropriate way, raising the questions and issues from our culture and society that will connect with people. I then want to see you doing most of the stuff, most of your work. I want to see you on persuasion. I want to see you using some of the tools to expose and to challenge the answers of the beliefs of our society, the non-Christian worldview, and then I want and showing how persuasively how Christianity makes better sense. And then I want, doesn't have to be as long this last section, but I love to see you I love to just challenge you to think about for invitation. Where might you go in the Gospels? How would you get to Jesus from here? What would be the link? And you've seen me do that in different ways over the weeks. There was the talk we did on suffering and COVID and healthcare, and the link was the Good Samaritan. There was the talk on, well, today's talk on the wedding feast, talking about history and how to be a part of all that God's doing and the better world that's coming at the end of history, but how to be part of it today through the resurrection. I told you last week about the transgender talk I'm working on, and how, weirdly enough, that because transgenderism is very much about cultural stereotypes about men and women, how actually the gospel text I'm going to go to is the story Look Like Mary and Martha, where Mary is applauded by Jesus for sitting at his feet and learning from him about what it truly means to be human, and how we can be saved and made right with God, which is what human life is ultimately for. So just, I'd love to see, show me where you would go. Maybe you don't necessarily have to develop it fully if you don't have the words in your word count. But I'd just love to see where would you go invitation-wise with the gospel, to show that Jesus is good news and the resolution to that problem, that issue, that question. That's what I'm looking for. So see you're working on a talk, Apologetics, Acts 17 talk. Put in the headings. That's what I want to see. Put in the headings. Invitation, identification, persuasion, invitation. Put in
You don't need to record it or anything like that. It's just purely on paper.
Just on paper. Yeah.
Okay.
Give me your bibliography as well. To show me what you've read and been thinking through in your studies alongside the course. You can cite reference the lecture notes and stuff as well, stuff from the lectures, and that's fine. If you've been doing other reading of books or things, just put that in, but to see what you can engage in with for that talk.
It's 1,500 words up to, is that right?
Yes, that was to try and be generous rather than to be nasty. So if you can do it in 1,000 words, that's fine. You can't do it in 200, so you won't get away with that. But that was to be generous, so you had a bit of space to develop things. I always was one of the students who needed more space than the word counts allowed, so I tried to be generous like that. But don't see it as a, if I don't do 1,500 words, if I only do 1,200, well, that's not going to be good enough. No, we'll let that go. Okay.
Thank you.
So I think John said to hand that in, submit by the start of January.
4th of January, I think you said, yeah.
Maybe submit it to John, send it into another Bible college, send it to John, and he'll get them to me in a bundle, and I'll get them marked and returned to you as soon as possible in the new year. Okay. Right. Thanks so much for your time. Let me pray. Well, Lord Jesus, we pray to you, the Lord of the universe, enthroned in heaven today, and we thank you for what we have seen and heard today about the reality that you came into this world. It's true. Christmas is true, and Easter is true, and everything has changed. We pray for your Holy Spirit to convict us deep in our hearts and our souls. These things are real, and we are right to build our lives upon them, to rest our destiny and our hopes and our meaning in you and your truth. We pray, Father, that you would help us to go on to be useful in your service as servants of your kingdom, fired with the hot coals of some of the things that we've learnt over the last few months together in this course. We pray these things now in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you very much.
You have survived. Well done.
Thank you, David.
Well, if you wondered after that first week where you're going to get there, but you did. Well done. I don't have a body count this time. That's good. It's not a tragedy. This is not a tragedy in the story.
Have you got any more classes, Joel, to do, or are you next term or with the EPC?
I'm doing some that